And we'll go ahead and turn it over to Steve to get us started. Thanks for being here.
Hi, yeah, thank you, Sarah, and thanks everybody. Good afternoon. So yeah, I hope this will be an enjoyable experience and informative for everybody. Let me see here. I just want to share a screen. Let's see. Okay, there we go. So I actually there's just one slide after, well, two slides, I guess. So um, the kind of just before we get into this, I just want to point out, just kind of a few caveats. So, if you are going to experiment with anything that we demonstrate here or talk about for work, of course, I would ask you that you first reach out to your supervisor and just talk to them about this. And then, the other big caveat, which actually there might be a third slide, but the other big caveat is never ever put any personal information or sensitive information into an AI program or really anywhere that's not appropriate. But even though these can certainly help you at work, you just be mindful that if you do happen to work with data, with sensitive information, definitely do not put any of that information in there. So having said that, I think, as we go through this, so there's a lot of examples that, aren't really practical for us to cover here. But, if you look things up, if you work with, us here in IT, and your supervisor and folks, I think you'll find that there could be a lot of other examples that we couldn't cover here today that could be helpful to you or your department in your role. So I will switch to a different share screen here and just kind of jump into some examples. So, I think first what we'll do is look at ChatGPT because that's, I think the probably most common of all, most popular at least right now of all of the different platforms that are accessible. And yeah, here we go. So I think I'm sharing the right thing. So can you all see just a, ChatGPT window? And I will zoom into this here. So if somebody just wants to give me a thumbs up or some reaction just so I can make sure people can see this okay. Should be
We're good. We
seeing.
can see. Yep.
Yeah, okay. So has anybody actually used this yet, interactively used? I mean, other than Kevin and the folks, the usual suspects, but anybody outside of, the technology realm, have you actually used one of these online services? No. Okay. Well, uh, whoop. Oh, yeah. Okay. A couple of folks. Yep. So yeah, although Jamie, I think I'd probably count you in that, techie group. Yeah, so there's a few folks, but there's also several that haven't. So well, we'll just dive in, kind of show you this, and then switch to a couple of other examples. So um, ChatGPT is just one of many products now. So it's a company that's been around for a few years, but relatively new, as far as a company. And they were kind of the first out of the gate with this public um, uh, accessible chat platform. So it's really designed to interact with you in just totally, human form. So you can ask it questions like um, uh, describe describe a typical day. So describe the typical day for a community college math instructor. and we'll see what it gets. And, keep in mind, I don't really know what it's going to say. So it generates all of these texts from its understanding of our language and from information that it's basically collected off the internet. So it's basically been scouring websites all over the internet, and it's cobbled that together, and it's coming up with a, potentially original, potentially a mixture of original and content online answer. And depending on how you ask the question, it could give you pretty different results. And so this here, and I'm just going to go through this really quick because this obviously isn't that useful of an example, but again, this is just a way to introduce everybody that hasn't seen it, because there's at least a few people that haven't. So my prompt was, a day in the life. Please describe a typical day for a college math instructor. So it's actually breaking it down hour by hour. So, preparation in the morning, first class, a break between class, second class, office hours maybe, and so on. So keeping in mind that this system doesn't really know anything about, what it's like to be an instructor, and it doesn't really understand what this means. It does understand our language and how, we like to see things. So, notice I didn't prompt anything, and it's, put some of these kind of headings in bold on its own. So it's just chosen to do that. It's bulleted some items. I didn't ask it to do that. It just did that on its own. So I'm gonna kind of dive into one more example, and this it's going to be a pretty techie example. Um, but before I leave this, I'm gonna put somebody on the spot. Maybe not right now, but after some of this, and I'm gonna ask for some audience feedback here, either in the chat or just verbally, to give some suggestions for things that you might think might be useful. Again, just keep that in mind. So we'll go through some more examples, but I don't want to let anybody leave today without giving some interaction there. So the other day, one of our kind of techie things that we do is we manage a bunch of information systems here, of course. So one of them is an online reporting platform. So it's called Informer, and it gets data from the colleague database and parses it. So there's a lot of security that's involved in that, and there was recently a change to the way that security worked, and I had to work with a new piece of software that I've never worked with before and come up with a way to do a filter. So basically redirect some stuff. So in other words, when you go to one website address, it translates that in a certain way. So again, this one might not be applicable to everybody, but I see Dan and Kevin, I see a few folks that are techies. So this was the exact prompt that I wrote. So I just said, hey, I'm writing a rule for this program. So URL rewrite is the new program that I hadn't used before. And I gave it some additional information, and theoretically, if it had scraped this website, so in other words, if it had pulled the data off this website, it would have probably have some sort of answer for me. So I am familiar with some of the general syntax of this, but every program is slightly different, as you know. So let's hit the button and see how it goes. So it's giving me really specific information, and this all looks super nerdy, and trust me, it is super nerdy. I could tell you that it was almost correct. There was just I think one or two really minor tweaks to it. But my just writing this, couple of sentences here saved me probably a good hour of work, or 30 minutes to an hour of work. So that's the first practical example. What was there, a chat message? No. Okay. So next here is kind of going to the left here, if I can sneak around Zoom. There we go. So how many folks regularly use the Microsoft Bing search engine, Bing? Okay, so probably nobody in that. Yeah, there's one no. So yes, thank you, Amy. So that no, I think, is heard around the world because Microsoft Bing has been a competitor to Google for I think about 12 plus years, and it's never been number one. It's always been number two or number three. So Microsoft made a deal with the folks that make ChatGPT, and they've combined ChatGPT with the Bing search engine. So one of the limitations of ChatGPT is all of the information. So all of the actual information that it has that it's spitting back to us, that was pulled, about a year or so ago. So it doesn't know anything about current events. However, Bing Chat, it's the same ChatGPT system, but it's interfaced with Microsoft's Bing search engine. So in other words, it can actually search on the internet for responses and parse that. So in other words, it's kind of like maybe just kind of jump starting a more powerful search, um, for whatever it is that you need to search for. So I I warned you ahead of time, so I'm gonna ask somebody. So think of a complex search, or a sentence or two that you could come up with for something that's current information, a current event, something pretty recent. It could be anything, but yeah, the more current, the better, just so we can kind of prove that this is using current information. And I will do a quick search based on some current information here. So
We have one question in the chat so far. Here comes another one.
just to make sure, oh, and I actually didn't increase the size on this one. So I just, can you please summarize the history of Ukraine and why it might be in a conflict with Russia? Yeah. So I'm a quick reader, so I read all of that. Um, Yeah, so you can see it says searching for, so it's doing a search first, and then it's coming up, it's kind of combining its search results with, um, it's a language model to come up with a summary. And I don't know if I see Russ or any of our, yeah, I don't see history faculty, but yep. So it says Ukraine is a country in Eastern Europe that's been in a conflict with Russia since 2014. It goes on to say that it noted that the conflict has, resulted in thousands of deaths. And you could see that there's a kind of fine dotted line there. It might be a little bit hard to see, but it's citing some sources. So you or a student or whomever, can click on that and get sources. So you could see it's a it's very similar to, the Google search or Bing search that we're used to, but it's a step above that. It's more conversational style. And I could follow up with that. I could ask a follow-up question of that. So I got some here. So let's see here. So I'll just go in order and I'll just do these really quick. So thank you, Dan. So who won the GOP debate? So I'm gonna just put this in just as it is. Yeah, I'm gonna just put this in just as it is, just to show, like GOP, what the heck does GOP mean, right? I mean, we're talking to a computer program. So let's see if it figures out what that means and if it can put it in context of current news, because that's pretty current. Yeah, well, this is a really interesting response, and I'm glad that it gave this response. So, uh, it's it's an interesting response. So, for anybody that can't read that, so it says, "I'm sorry, but I can't find any recent GOP debates. The latest GOP debate I could find was held in 2023. However, I can tell you that the winner of the first Republican debate of the 2024 GOP primary race was Donald Trump, which is interesting, but it actually goes on to cite sources. So again, it doesn't really understand what it's saying. It's culling information from the internet. And so I think we have time for a couple more. So statistical data on the most recent hurricane to occur in the US. We'll see if we can find that. And I'll mention one of the demos that I did not include here, and if there's any math faculty here, but there's a company called Wolfram, which makes a product called Mathematica. They also make an online product called Wolfram Alpha, ALPHA, and that's sort of a search engine or a interactive chat for math. So you can actually work on statistics and math problems with it. And that, for anybody that's really into math and statistics, that's pretty fun to play around with that. So yeah, so look at how accurate it's being in a way. So it's saying, I'm sorry, I can't find any recent hurricanes. And I believe that's because technically the Hillary was degraded to a tropical storm when it hit California. It was a hurricane when it touched on Mexico, but it was a tropical storm when it reached California. So that's some insight that that's interesting. And then there's again links uh, to third-party sites, to articles. And then let me see here. So I'll just go to this here. Oh, whoops, I'm sorry, Katie, I scrolled too far, I skipped over yours. So yeah, so it's saying I'm not sure if there's a fully accessible version of the Enduring Vision textbook. However, you can try contacting the publisher. So it couldn't find what it was looking for, but it's giving us some actual suggestions. And that's a great example. And I think I might not have time for another one, so I think I'm going to switch to yeah, actually, I'm going to switch to this Chat GPT for Sheets. So, I'll preface this with there's a free trial of this, but it is a paid product. I can't remember exactly how much it is. I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood of $20 or less. Um, and I'll also mention that this functionality interfaces with ChatGPT. So it's basically, even though we're working in a spreadsheet, the backend is the same ChatGPT that we've been working with before, although there's a few nuances. So I have, three kind of tabs here at the bottom, and I'm going to try to make this a little bit larger. So hopefully folks can see it. So for folks that work with spreadsheets, which probably is a lot of us, but sometimes you want to use a spreadsheet to clean up data. Sometimes you use it to clean up text data. So if you've ever used, Google or email clients, there's a function you can copy email addresses that are in an email thread. However, the way a lot of those programs work is it's copying the email address in a format like this. So it's got the person's name in double quotes, and then it's got a less than sign, and then the email address, and it's surrounded by a greater than sign. So what IT people call brackets. So if I wanted to, just extract email addresses for, folks that know Excel, there's multiple ways to do that. Since all of these are in a similar format, we could use the text to columns feature of Excel or Google Sheets and split that out. It would take a few steps, but we could still do it. However, there's a different way to do it. So this program gives you some additional functions in that are available to Google Sheets. Microsoft also has a similar product called Copilot. Copilot isn't going to be available for us here at the college for a little while, but this functionality is kind of a preview of what will be accessible to you, what will be possible at some point. So let's see here. So there's a function called GPT fill, and for folks that are familiar with Excel, when you fill in a formula and then drag it around the spreadsheet to have it automatically calculate values, that's often called the fill function. So this is called GPT fill, but it works differently. So it takes parameters. The first parameter is an example of what you want something to look like. So I'm going to show it these first two rows. So I only formatted these first two rows, and I'm going to tell it to look at these cells. So these are my example. Oops, and I'm sorry about that. So these are the example, and then I'm telling it to apply that example to all of these other fields here, or values here. So you could see, and there's probably some Excel folks that are cringing, saying, "Gosh, Steve, you're really lazy because you could have done that in 2 or 3 steps a different way." This is just one example, but you could see all I had to do was show it an example of what I wanted, what the input is and what I wanted the output to look like, and it went ahead and did that on all these other examples, including examples that didn't quite that were different, that had extra punctuation marks. Different lengths, a hyphen there, not a single word name, and so on. So the next example. So I know a lot of folks, man, we're always trying to have some new content. And publishers will often give us test banks, but often you want to come up with something that's a variation of something there. So maybe you can have a couple of different versions of a quiz, maybe. So again, this is just a front end to ChatGPT, so we could have done the same thing by typing in the prompt, but it might be more efficient this way. But there's one additional feature that's kind of nifty here. So these responses that ChatGPT are giving, you can actually control how original they are. So this is called the temperature. This is, what the AI folks call the temperature. So a temperature of 0 means, hey, if you saw this, if you scrape something like this off the internet, just give it to me more or less, as vanilla as possible. And then it goes all the way up to 1, which means, hey, go crazy with it. You use your robot brain to go a little crazy with this. So at the top here, I just have a prompt. So it says, write a college level quiz question directly related to, and then I have it filled in the cell value up here. So the prompts or the question is up at the top. So that way I could just easily kind of drag this around and have multiple questions on it. So I'm going to hit enter on that. And so that's a pretty, generic question. So I will, and just in the interest of time here, I'll delete a few of these. So, whoops, I don't want to delete that many. So I'll do like maybe 0.5 and then 0.1. So now we're going to crank up the originality a couple of notches. So the first question was, what was the primary cause of the American Revolution? The second one is about the same. The third one, which has more originality, is what were the leading nations involved in the American Revolution, in that world context? And let's see here. So I'll skip to this one here. So this question is, give me a quiz question for, regarding significant places of the American Revolution. So the first one is, what's the significance of Valley Forge? And I'll just drag this down 2 more. And you can see, it's interesting that it's not quite the same behavior. So when I had 0.5 before, it actually provided some different behavior. So it's, it's not entirely predictable. It's a positive and a negative. So, what were the historical and political significances of Boston and Lexington upon the onset of the American Revolution? So just given, that simple prompt, it gave some of those questions. Of course, I could just keep dragging this down and keep coming up with more questions and pick and choose from that. And let's see, so the final one here, I know we got 3 minutes. So the final one, it's kind of similar, except it's longer. It's a little bit more complex. So this one here is a question that I picked off of a website, so it's not my own original question there, but the question is, it's in context of Romeo and Juliet, the play. So how does the suicidal impulse that both Romeo and Juliet exhibit relate to the overall theme of young love? And then I set the temperature on this one to 0.8. So now it's coming up with an alternative way to phrase that question. And this time, you notice I just hit it once and it gave me 3 or 4, and that's just a different function. It's a list. And my prompt was provide 5 alternative ways to ask the following college example short essay question. So in other words, give me 5 other kind of similar ways to ask this first question. So, what is the significance? How it's, and you can see that in some cases here it just changed a couple of words, but in a couple other cases it really was a different question. So we went over, I think, about 8 or 9 examples, and I think we have a couple of minutes left, so I'll just open it up. Does anybody want to see another example or have any questions or anything in the minute or so we have remaining? And I'll just point out too that Dr. Parlier posted in the chat there a link to a survey form. So, yep.
Yeah.
Well,
Steve, I want to thank you on behalf of everyone here on the call. Thank you for your time and for sharing what you've already been doing and, maybe making some suggestions that we could talk with you more about. Really, this is just the start of some conversations, I imagine. So if Steve said something today or showed you something that piqued your interest, I know he's available, and a few of us on the call here are, working pretty actively to stay current. But really, this is going to be something that we, as a college, need to crowdsource and share and collaborate on because it's changing every day, right, Steve?
yes,
Yeah.
it is. Yeah. Yeah. So definitely, touch base with your supervisor. But also, now is a good time to experiment. So I didn't get a chance to show you, but in addition to Bing, and ChatGPT, there's also Google has a product called Bard. So if you just go to bard.google.com, it's not yet accessible to us when we're logged in with our accounts here at the college. They're probably going to change that at some point soon. But if you have your own Google account, a Gmail account, bard.google.com, and it's just another one of these engines, but Bard is a little bit different because it's got the power of all of the data that Google already has. So it's interesting, definitely a different experience. So thanks everybody.
Thank you all.